From the Wharton School of the University of Pennsylvania and SiriusXM, this is the Work and Life podcast, which explores how to create harmony among the different parts of life: work, home, community, and the private self, your mind, body, and spirit. The conversation you're about to hear was originally recorded on the Work and Life radio show on SiriusXM 111, business radio powered by Wharton. Here's your host, founding director of Wharton's Work-Life Integration Project and author of the bestseller Total Leadership, Professor Stu Friedman.
Sam Polk was a senior Wall Street trader who ditched it all and then went on to found organizations that help bring healthy food to poor communities in Los Angeles. Those organizations are called Groceryships and Everytable. His powerful book, which is called For the Love of Money, chronicles his struggle to overcome what he refers to as his addiction to wealth. This podcast episode combines two conversations I've had with Sam on the air. The first was when he published a New York Times op-ed piece a couple of years ago, and the second is a recent update on what's happened since. We talk about Sam's insider take on the culture of Wall Street, the pressures he felt from his father and from our society that led him to his wealth addiction, how he overcame it, and the great work Sam is now doing in Los Angeles with Groceryships and Everytable. I hope you'll enjoy this episode of Work and Life. Sam, welcome to Work and Life, and thank you so much for joining us today.
Thanks, Stu. It's good to be here.
You know, as I think you know, I learned about you when you wrote the much talked about opinion piece in the New York Times a couple of years ago. I want to talk with you about how that led you to your great new book, For the Love of Money. Your story is such a compelling example of someone who's able, really through this crucible of really painful experience, to find a way to live a truly integrated life.
Yeah, so I talked about how I went to Wall Street when I was 22. I had a summer internship at CSFB, and I remember walking onto the trading floor and just being blown away. I mean, Wall Street was sort of everything that I could have ever wanted out of a life. And so I worked at CSFB, and then I got a full-time job at Bank of America.
Hey, let me just jump in here, Sam.
Yeah.
Everything that you wanted in life was right there on the trading floor? Really?
Yeah, I mean, certainly for that sort of 22-year-old kid. My dad was this guy who sort of believed, we sort of grew up sort of lower middle class, and he was always sort of reading the paper and talking about, billionaires and people that were really successful, and he wasn't successful, but he wanted to be successful so bad. And so I grew up sort of with that huge desire in my heart, or in my head, rather.
Mm-hmm.
And I remember walking onto that trading floor, and we had, we moved up to a sort of a nice area of town for high school, so I'd been around some wealth in my life.
Mm-hmm.
And I remember walking out onto that trading floor and just seeing people who, just by looking at them and the kind of clothes they wore and the, pants they wore and the kind of haircuts and what their sort of skin looked like, you could just tell they played golf a lot. And it was just like a different level of wealth than I'd ever seen.
Mm.
And so for me, I was like a kid about to graduate from Columbia, terrified about sort of finding my place in the world, and really, terrified about where I was going to end up, and, was I going to be important, and was I going to matter? And to me, those guys on Wall Street looked like they mattered.
Because they had all the external trappings or the indications of what wealth?
Yeah, I mean, it's a funny thing. It's like I think you're sort of like pointing, or at least asking questions around this really interesting issue, which is one of the results of that New York Times piece I wrote is that I got hundreds of letters from college kids, and most of them were in some way or another sort of asking me if I could help them get onto Wall Street. Yeah, but I really understood where they were coming from, because they were taught, they sort of like, they knew, they didn't come out and directly ask it sometimes because I had written a story that was sort of, about leaving Wall Street for this and that reason.
And that inspired kids to write to you, say, how do I get a job on Wall Street?
Well, that's what I'm trying to get at, is that, like, yeah, they did that, but then they also opened up about sort of what it felt like to be a college kid. And I mean, we think that these kids that go to school where you teach, Wharton or Columbia or Harvard, that they sort of like have it all made, right? And in some sense they really do. But they're also sort of stepping out into adulthood, into a culture that has told them from birth that really the only way to sort of be valuable in the world is to be rich, powerful, or famous. And there are none of those at that time. And so I remember for me, I was terrified when I was about to graduate. I was terrified, Columbia was this sort of badge of honor and prestige, and I was like, God, where am I going to go? Am I going to just sort of disappear into the world? And then here comes Credit Suisse First Boston or Goldman Sachs, and they say, here, you have an equally prestigious brand name, and you're on this path that, our culture sort of celebrates and then vilifies,
Well, not so much vilifies, though, when you were getting into it, right? When did you graduate from Columbia?
Yeah, it was 2002 was my first internship. So
okay,
it was right
so
after the internet bubble burst.
But in 2002, though, it was still, there wasn't that much vilification, or was there?
No, absolutely. I mean, I think that we've always, as a, Western culture or a, post-BC culture, we've always had this thing about moneylenders and, people, Scrooge, and there is this sort of like backdrop of like, hey, money's not going to make you happy. But that maybe, in my mind, takes up like 3% of the sort of cultural dialogue, and the 97% is all about, oh my God, get money as fast as you can and as much as possible, and by the way, Wall Street is the place to do that.
Right.
So pretty much I, continued up the Wall Street ladder, years and years of working really hard and becoming a trader and then a hedge fund trader, and I started to make real money and sort of live that life that I'd sort of dreamed of. So, I would fly into the airport and there'd be a black car waiting for me, and I could go to any restaurant I wanted. I went to so many World Series games on brokers, credit cards.
Really?
Yeah, I mean, it was just like, I could go
all those
to
Yankee games?
Yankee games, Knicks games. I could be second row at the Knicks sort of whenever I wanted. It was like there was, and for, remember, I was a 25, 26-year-old kid, and so that was a tremendous feeling of power in the world.
And you did all that without breaking the law?
Yeah, I think 99% didn't break the law.
All right.
I mean, there were some things like, I remember once we flew out to Vegas on a broker's dime, and I remember noticing that our seats, we went to see the De La Hoya Mayweather fight, and I remember our seats were better than Sacha Baron Cohen's seats. And I remember seeing him and being like, oh, wow. And then I asked somebody how much these tickets were, and they were like, oh, these are $5,000 a pop. And I was like, that may not be legal.
Right. All right. So that's a relatively minor transgression, probably.
Yeah, probably. But yeah, it was all totally above board.
So you're living the life, the dream.
I'm living the life, and the thing that I started to notice was like, look, there is no doubt that sort of making money, getting $1 million bonus feels good, and you go home that night and you show your girlfriend, I am proud of this. Look at this, But then I also noticed at the same time that the higher I went, it wasn't like the sort of jealousy and envy that sort of had motivated me in my life. And I mean that, like, those college kids that write to me, they're looking at these sort of people they read in the paper, Lloyd Blankfein and Jamie Dimon, and they're saying, God, I want to be that. And that's how I felt too. I'd see really rich people, or I'd read an article about a trader or a billionaire in the paper, and I'd be like, I'd just be swarmed with envy. As an aside, it makes me wonder, like, how many readers of, like, Us Magazine and Forbes and Bloomberg just read those and just feel envy the whole time they're reading it, And I would feel like that, and even as I continued to make millions, I still noticed that I felt like that, and I started to say, like, there's something wrong there. And then, sort of going back to what you were talking about, like, trading was like, to me as like a 22-year-old, it looked like the coolest thing in the world, and it was so much fun, like making big bets and seeing, news headlines that all of a sudden made you $1 million, and it was really exciting. But over time, I started to sort of like separate from actually what I was doing and be like, sort of just be like, this stuff that I'm doing every day doesn't matter, and there's nothing sort of valuable about it, even though I'm getting very well compensated for it.
Did you say something valuable or value less?
Yeah. There's not something valuable
Not.
about it.
So was there a moment where something clicked, or did it just kind of build up over time that you realized there's something wrong here?
There were so many moments. I mean, one I talked about in the Times piece was this moment where my billionaire boss was saying, I was in a meeting, and this was in 2009, so it was like in the worst part of the crash, and we were talking about the new hedge fund regulations being made by Congress. And by the way, our hedge fund was up money during that time, so everybody else was losing money, and we were making money. And I remember I was in a meeting, and we were talking about the new hedge fund regulations, and everybody thought they were a bad idea, but I was sort of in the midst of this crisis where I was sort of seeing the sort of greed that was in me, but also this system that I was a part of, this sort of financial system that had in some sense caused some of this collapse, and then to my mind sort of wasn't taking accountability for it. And I kind of puffed at my chest and said, well, isn't this better for the system as a whole? And my boss just shot me this sort of withering glare and said, I don't have the brain capacity to think about the system as a whole. I can only think about what's good for us and our company.
That's what your boss said.
Yeah, and it wasn't so much, maybe I judged him, but more than anything, like I judged myself, and I was like, God, there's got to be more to this than, my dream my whole life had been to be a billionaire. And I saw this guy, and, I'm not saying all billionaires are like this guy or whatever, anything like that, but I would have, the fact that he was a billionaire, to me, in my mind, billionaire was like hero, or has it made. And the fact that he was still sort of self-seeking, for lack of a better word, made me say, made me just realize in that moment, there is no end point. There's no, at least for most of us, or at least for me, there's no moment where you say, oh, I've got enough, I'm done, let me go do, what I was meant to do. And a lot of these kids that wrote me, these college kids, would say that. One kid wrote me in particular, I remember, he was like, Sam, I just want enough money to travel and take care of my parents, take care of my wife, and I want to go to Wall Street, and the number I have in my mind is $6 million. And I was like, first of all, I have way less than $6 million, FYI. And B, 99% of the world has less than $6 million. And really, maybe that's true that you would be the one guy who, if you got to $6 million, if you spent your 20 years, then you would stop. But for most of us, and at least most of my friends on Wall Street, what it looked like from my eyes is that they got that $6 million, and then they wanted 12, and then they wanted 18, and so they had nicer houses and nicer cars.
The habit had been built; it didn't stop.
Yeah, they still had that hole sort of inside, and that's that we were all sort of trying to fill with money, power, prestige. My sort of belief, okay, and this is just me personally, but is that I was trying to fill this. I would call this hole inside me. I would call it like and this is not how I thought consciously about it, but it's how I've come to think about it. Is this sort of sense of worthlessness. And the only way that I sort of thought I was valuable was Columbia, making $1 million on Wall Street, having a big loft apartment on Bond Street in downtown New York, and those things that that you get when you're on Wall Street. And after a while, I just sort of realized that hole was still there, no matter how much money I was trying to fill it with. And I said, I started to really do some work and say, we have this really brief life, and not to get all philosophical, but we have this...
No, let's get all philosophical, Sam.
And we have this really brief life, and the sort of, if you play out the Wall Street story all the way, what you end up with is like a guy who maybe has $100 million, and the world thinks he's successful, and he's in the papers, and he's got all this stuff, but in the end, he's just spent his entire life trying to aggregate both money and, accolades for himself. And And I think I really do believe, that's why I feel like a lot of compassion for these college kids, is because I believe that's what our culture tells us to do. Like, I believe, like, we all hear about Jesus and we all hear about Mother Teresa, but really the culture says, you are important if you go and start your tech company and turn it into $1 billion. And so you go out and try to do that, and in the end, even if you're successful, I believe you sort of haven't done anything. And that was sort of the thing for me, which was like, you know, I still talk to this spiritual teacher who has been, you know, who I'm more grateful for than anybody I could ever imagine. And she used to say things to me like, oh yeah, those billionaires, they don't mean anything. Or she would say it like as if they weren't successful, and to me that was heresy. And I'd be like, no, they're a billionaire. You don't understand. These are important, powerful people, but to her, they weren't.
Wait, so you sought out the advice and counsel of a spiritual guide at some point along your path here to awareness, to greater awareness of what was wrong?
Yeah, I mean, it was actually right in the beginning, and that's the thing, you know, you ask if this is like a moment that happened, but really, you know, 3 weeks into that first internship at Credit Suisse First Boston, I was dating this girl, in love with this girl, and we'd been together for 2 years, and 3 weeks into my internship, she dumped me. And I was I mean, you know, I kind of
Wait, so you had been dating her before you began this internship?
Yeah, I was dating her at Columbia.
Oh, okay.
And I was dating her, and she dumped me, and it was like, it was one of those sort of like first love, didn't see it coming, devastating heartbreaks. And, you know, I've been through some pain in my life, but I tell you, breakup pain is right up there. And I was so devastated that I could barely sort of do anything. I could barely eat. I could barely get out of bed in the morning.
And so you were depressed, it sounds like.
I was immediately depressed. But I had this internship that was the most important thing in the world to me, aside from this girlfriend. And so I
which was more important?
Yeah, well, I mean, I'm glad that the internship was so important because it allowed me to sort of, I guess, humble myself enough to call this woman who I'd met a couple years before when that same girlfriend took us to couples counseling. And she was this Native American spiritual teacher. And when I'd gone the first time, I thought, okay, first of all, she's not a PhD in psychology. She's not a psychiatrist. There's no Ivy League degree on her wall. No, thank you. But then 2 years later, she was the only sort of counselor I knew. And so I called her, and I started working with her every week. And by the way, every week from then until now. And I still talk to her. In fact, right now, I talk to her twice a week. And what she sort of was talking to me into my ear. She was almost whispering, you know, a completely different perspective on the world, which was, you know, Wall Street was all about a hierarchy, right? And I believe that our culture is about a hierarchy that says, you know, the more money you make and the more famous you are and the bigger the tech company is that you started, the more valuable and important you are. And so that's what we're all on this, or at least I was, on this sort of chase to get up to the top of that. And that's what these college kids who are writing me are in the beginning stages of their attempt to meet the hierarchy. And she would say the opposite. She would say, no, there is no hierarchy. Everybody is equally valuable. What you think of as like the way the world works is actually just how your sort of culture sees it, but Native American culture saw it totally differently, and they saw it that everybody was equally valuable, and that the focus, the sort of value of a life was in the sort of inner character that you cultivated as opposed to your outside achievements, and how you treated the love and empathy and compassion you treated people with as opposed to what's on your business card. And, you know, frankly, I thought she was a wacko, you know, and I was like, you know, I was 22, and I was like, okay, yeah, but just tell me how I can get over this breakup so I can get on to
my $1 billion quest.
Yeah. But, you know, by the time I left, I was on Wall Street for 8 years, and I'd say, you know, the first year I sort of believed her about 10% and Wall Street 90%. And then halfway through I believed her about 40% and Wall Street 60%. But then towards the end I started to actually think, hey, you know what, maybe she's right, you know? And that's when I started to, like, sort of understand. It was almost like a moment like in The Matrix where, he takes the red pill and he comes to see the truth of the world that he's in. And in some sense that's what happened to me. I would just hear these conversations that I had heard 100 times before about, on Wall Street you refer to people, literally by the size of their bank account. So somebody would say, hey, that guy over there, he's a $25 million guy. Or they'd say, that guy over there, he's a $100 millionaire. And it just occurred to me that this wasn't about, how much money they had, so what they could do with that money. It was just how much money they had as a signifier of their value as a human being.
You are listening to the Work and Life podcast. This is Stu Friedman, your host, and I've been speaking with Sam Polk about his career on Wall Street, the expensive restaurants, big sporting events, multi-million-dollar bonuses, pursuing the dreams of his father, and how he became disillusioned with the extreme wealth and left Wall Street. What we speak about in the next part of the show is what happened next and how he then moved from Wall Street to change his work life entirely. We're going to talk about the two organizations Sam founded to provide nutritious food to underserved communities in Los Angeles. That's coming up next.
Well, so I left Wall Street when I was 30, which was, till then, probably the hardest thing that I'd ever done. And it was like, I literally just resigned. And my boss, I sort of manufactured a reason to argue with my boss. But in the end, as I was leaving, he was like, I'm sorry you're leaving. I think you could have made a lot of money here. And, that was like a harpoon in my heart, because I really was like walking away right at the height of my sort of earning capacity.
But I thought you had already been making a lot of money.
So this is how I'll tell you what I made, and this is just bonuses, I think, if I remember correctly. But my first year, I think I had 7 years of bonuses or something like that. So it was like $40,000, $75,000, $125,000, $500,000, $1 million, $1.5 million, and then $3.75 million. And imagine that on a graph.
Our engineer is weeping now as you're speaking. I'm sorry to tell you, but continue.
I know. And imagine that. But just so you know, about that $3.75 million, I had to give back half of it because that was part of the deal with the hedge fund. Is that if you left at any time during that year, you had to give back half your last year's bonus.
Ouch! So you had to give up almost $2 million to walk away.
That's right. And ahead of me was like, by the way, my boss, so there was billionaires, and then there was the head of trading, and then there was me. I was a senior trader, and as I was leaving, the head of trading resigned. So I was at least in contention to be head of trading, and I don't say that for my own ego, but just to say that, like, I still sometimes chuckle about, like, there was a lot of multi-million dollar bonuses in the future sort of stretching out. And it was really hard, both for me in general because I'd been so focused on making money my whole life, but also because it really was like walking away from, the beliefs of a culture, and like, there was a lot of people that I talked to during that time who didn't agree with that decision, and a lot still don't.
I have to ask you, Sam, is your father still around?
My dad's still around,
and so
but I don't. He would not have agreed with that decision, although him and I don't talk very often these days.
I see.
I didn't seek his counsel.
I see. Yeah, because from what you were saying earlier, it seemed like this would be hard for him to grasp.
It would be hard for him to grasp. That's right. But in a lot of ways, that's sort of what this was about. I mean, we talk about like where that sense of worthlessness comes from. And for me, a lot of it came from my dad. My dad was this guy who was, focused on money and focused on himself and his sort of extracurricular activities and not so much focused on me. And so, it was, and he also had this like temper, and so my sort of experience growing up with my father was this experience of not being his focus and also becoming more and more desperate to impress him. And that's the thing that, like, I hope to convey a little bit in my article and also this book that I've written, which is that, like, from my bosses, and Wall Street were my dad in so many ways. I went from being a teenager trying to impress my dad from wrestling, winning wrestling tournaments, to a 25-year-old trying to impress my boss by making a $10 million all-tel trade.
I spoke with Sam more recently about Groceryships and Everytable, and that conversation follows next.
Okay, you've propelled yourself out of this orbit of the soul-deadening work that had been, your life's dream, and you created something new. So tell us briefly how you got from there to there.
Yeah, so about 3 years after I left, I really hadn't done anything but started writing until then. I became aware of this intersection that exists between poverty and obesity. And what I mean is that, for example, in South Los Angeles, per capita income is $13,000 a year, and life expectancy is 10 years lower than more affluent areas. And there's a lot of reasons for that, but it definitely includes the fact that South LA is a food desert, which means that there's no fresh produce for sale, but tons and tons of fast food. And I was so sort of inspired by this idea that healthy food is a human right that every person, and certainly every parent, should be able to afford to put on the table for their kids and have access to. So the first thing we did was I started a nonprofit called Groceryships that basically helps parents living in food deserts get themselves and their families healthy. And it's a 6-month program that includes nutrition education and healthy cooking skills and fresh produce each week, and it's done in the context of a support group. So instead of like a didactic lecture, it's actually led by people from the community, and a lot of time is given to talking about the other issues that are deeply wrapped up with eating that include addiction and family issues and trauma issues. So that's Groceryships, and it's this incredible nonprofit that is, this year we'll do 30 groups of 300 moms, and I'm very proud of that. But about 2 years ago, in fact, another finance guy, a former private equity guy, came to work. He went to a Groceryships graduation and was so inspired, he started volunteering and then came to work with us full time. And him and I were sitting in this office in South LA and kept hearing these moms say, hey, look, I'm a single mom. I've got 4 kids and 2 jobs, and this produce is great, but I need to eat on the go, and in this neighborhood, that means McDonald's. And we started putting our minds together to figure out a business that would allow us to provide healthy meals that were affordable to these moms in South LA. And what we came up with is this business, this social enterprise called Everytable, and how it works really quickly is that there's a commissary kitchen producing a large amount of healthy, delicious meals. And then at that commissary kitchen, these meals are packaged in grab-and-go containers. And that really is the key economic insight of it all, which is that you walk into like a fast food place and there's 2,500 square feet of space and 10 to 15 employees and a fully built-out kitchen, all of which is why those places will never sell really inexpensive food. But for us, we open instead a network of small footprint stores that don't have a kitchen, just sell grab-and-go food. And because of that, we have this incredibly low cost structure. But we then go even farther and implement a variable pricing structure where in poorer communities, we sell the food for lower prices than in the higher income communities. So our average price in lower income is about $4, and then in the higher income places about $8.
Wow! So you can adjust your pricing according to the local environment, and how does that help you and sustain your business model?
Well, what it allows us to do is be competitive in every market, and for us, we focus on the total margins of the business, but we don't have to focus on the same margin from each customer. So every store is individually profitable, but differently profitable.
Sam, we are unfortunately out of time here, but in the last 30 seconds, what's the big idea that you want to leave our listeners with?
I think the big idea is that success has to be redefined to include making an intentional contribution into the world.
Mm-hmm. That is a powerful message. It is an important one for people to hear, and your inspiring story is so instructive in letting people see how it's possible. So thank you so much for sharing it with us on this show, for writing about it in your great new book. It's called For the Love of Money. You can check out the book and his website at sampolk.me. You can follow him on Twitter at Sam Polk. That's SAMPOLK. Sam, is there somewhere else that you'd like to direct our listeners for more information?
Yeah, please go to www.everytable.com.
Everytable.com. Sam Polk, thank you so much for joining us on Work and Life.
Thank you. It's been a pleasure.
I hope you enjoyed my conversation with Sam Polk. Sam found a way to act with integrity by creating a greater sense of coherence among the different parts of his life after feeling intense dissonance. And he got help in taking these steps from a spiritual guide. You know, everyone needs someone to talk to, whether it's a friend, a family member, a coach, a mental health professional, a religious teacher, anyone you trust, really, about what matters most and how to make changes to better align what you do with what you care about. Sam's current work is personally meaningful in part because he and his family struggled with obesity during Sam's childhood. Now he provides nutritious food and health education to families in need. This is a great example of someone taking his personal experience and converting it into work, to action that is of value to other people. A real leader. I hope you found his story to be instructive, if not inspiring, as I find it, as you pursue harmony between work and the rest of your life. Thanks for listening to this episode of Work and Life. This conversation was originally recorded on my weekly radio show on Sirius XM 111, Business Radio powered by Wharton. Tune in for live broadcasts of Work and Life on Tuesdays at 7 p.m. Eastern. For more about today's guest and about previous guests, check out our blog at workandlifepodcast.com. Join the conversation by commenting there or tweeting at Stu Friedman. And for more ideas and tools for creating harmony among the different parts of life, check out our website, totalleadership.org, and my book, Total Leadership. Be a better leader, have a richer life. If you like this podcast, please subscribe and share it with your friends, family, and coworkers. Until next time, I'm your host, Stu Friedman, and I thank you for joining me.